Welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at the BLON BL-A8, the one formerly known as Prometheus. So I want to thank KeepHiFi.com for sending this to me, and by no fault of their own, it took absolutely forever to arrive. It was taking so long, they started to message me and ask me if it had arrived, and can I call the post office, figure out where it's at, but it was just normal. For those of you who experienced this through AliExpress, sometimes it just gets stuck between their shipping partner and the U.S. Postal Service. It happens quite often to me, and this is one where it happened to me as well. So the interesting thing about ordering it a little later was the black version became available by the time I got around to ordering it. So most of the initial reviews were on the silver version. So this is what the black version looks like, and it's actually a little, I would say it's blacker on video than it is in person. It's still a very dark gray, but not quite the gloss black that it looks like on video. And I had a hard time getting any pictures of it because it looks simply like gloss black. And it's not quite that. It's kind of a little more, and it's not gunmetal either. It's somewhere between very dark gray, but not quite black. So in person, it looks a little better than it does on video, so I apologize for that, but that's what happened. But I'm glad that I had a chance to show people what the black version looks like, because everyone knows what the silver version looks like. So this is the cable also. This is the new silver-plated copper cable from BLON, so super nice. Not the stringy black thing that everyone remembers from the BL-03. This is a very soft, fancy-looking SBC cable. So when we get into it, you know, number one basically spells out the ultimate issue with A8. One is the price. The price in US dollars is about $80 from keephifi.com. That's what, two to three times more expensive than the BLON BL-03. And I think people have a hard time rationalizing paying, a multiple for the A8, because what you get back isn't necessarily 2 to 3 times better than the O3. It's slightly different, and for some people that is going to be better, but for some people it's not. It's not a 2 to 3 times better O3. It's the A8. It's not the O3. So it's kind of hard to get that through their mind. And the second is the other bit of that is, why isn't it another O3? It's because the balance is quite different from the O3. Maybe that center of gravity changed from maybe a sub-bass focused O3 to something that's more in the upper range sound, which you get on the A8. And for most people, that is different, and the balance between bass and treble is different, and it lost a little bit of that natural sound that the O3 had. So people are trying to get past this. I'm paying a lot more, and it seems like it's not quite as natural as the O3, so what did I pay for? And then the other people are going to say, well, now I actually have a more improved O3 because I didn't like the O3 to begin with. It was too bassy, too muddy. The A8 is much cleaner, much more treble, upper range. It actually works with my playlist much better. So that's sort of the mixed reviews that you got to read while I was waiting for my A8 to arrive, and that's kind of my take on what really happens with the A8 when it's in people's hands. So second thing that's odd about the A8 is it is super picky with tips or filters or cables or sources. It feels like I had multiple versions of the A8. As you're tip rolling this thing, or cable rolling, or putting filters on it, or changing sources, it changes very quickly from really quite bad to quite good. And you got to keep on working at it to get it to the point where it sounds good to you. And for me, it ended up being these KZ Starline tips. I don't use the BLON tips. They were kind of useless to me. This is the Yinyu copper alloy cable. If you're a cable believer, you're probably going to go reach for some kind of copper to add a little taming to the treble, if that's what you believe in. If not, the tips are actually going to do all that heavy lifting for you and knock down that upper mid treble a little bit. On a source side, if you're into some of these new dongles that people have been talking about, this is the ZooX cable. It's about ZooX dongle. That's about $8 with the new cable. I can't recommend this combination. It was nearly unlistenable, so I will leave it at that. So just be super careful if you find yourself, spending good money on the A8 and don't like it. It really comes down to trying to dial in that sound to get it closer to what your preferences are, as opposed to what, something like this, which was super harsh. And then this is a much smoother version of that, and it's simply just tips and source versus, the A8 is just a horrible set if you have it and it sounds harsh. You got to keep on dialing it in. So sound and graph kind of explains a little bit of what they did. So you can kind of see, especially on the left side, they brought down the bass quite a bit. And that's just to clean out some of that bleed, a little less bassy, because that was a big complaint on the 03. The mids look about the same. They don't sound the same, mainly because you get a big contribution from this upper area, so it sounds quite a bit brighter. Depending on your source, it's like wicked bright and wicked harsh, but you do have to work on getting this mitigated a little bit down to a level that's more aligned with your preferences, because it definitely can sound a bit bright and harsh under the wrong conditions. But generally, it's kind of a boosted V shape, not super far from the 03, just a different balance between the bass and the upper range. So the bass, depending on who you are, and if you are a big fan of the 03, it's the new one on the A8 is tight and fast, or it's going to be not enough or too fast. For 03 fans, it's going to sound a lot like there's not enough bass there, or it just decays way too fast. It's not satisfying, is how I would say it. But I think generally it just needs to be a bit deeper and maybe a little bit slower to balance out the treble, because you get into this position where the treble is very prominent and there's a lot of emphasis to it, and it really needs to be balanced out by something on a lower end to feel more in balance, to me anyway. But in isolation, the levels actually sounds quite nice and the quality isn't bad. It's definitely, if you were an 03 person who wasn't a fan of all that bass, it's definitely going to sound much better, more under control, and like I said, tighter and faster. But as you start layering instruments over it, guitars or synths, it sort of fades away. It doesn't stick around too much. The level is okay, but it kind of gets swamped out by the upper mids, and you saw that on the graph. So a track like The Cure's Love Song, the extended mix of it, starts off strong. There's that nice bass section right in the beginning, and then as the guitars come in and the synths and the snares and all that stuff layers on top of the bass, it really kind of fades away, and it changes the character of that track from one where there should be a very heavy foundation in the bass, and you should hear some of the guitars and the synths, and those should be nice and bright and detailed, and it just kind of shifts more towards the upper end, so it just loses a little bit of, whether you call that natural sound. The instruments sound a little brighter, the synths are quite bright, but I think it's more so the balance is just a bit off from what I expected. But on the other hand, someone will definitely going to appreciate the cleaner mids from not having all that bleed in from the bass, and on the other hand, someone will want a richer bass, like I said. So kind of a mixed bag depending on who you are and what you prefer, so take that into account. The mids is almost the same story. It's not BL-03 rich, it's not those smooth, thick vocals. It's a lighter, faster, brighter, more detailed version of those, maybe lightweight, but much cleaner. There's definitely more clarity without all that bleeding, and there's this apparent increase in resolution. Not necessarily, you're not going to be wowed by, I can hear things that I didn't hear before, but everything just sounds a little sharper. There's a little bit more clarity to it, but I wouldn't say that there's tons more detail than the 03. It just sounds a bit sharper to me. So the male vocals, kind of the same problem. As you go down in the mids, they get a little bit thinner. You're missing some of that lower end foundation that I talked about in the bass. So the male's a little bit thinner. I don't know. not as detailed, but then female vocals ride up on that gain, and it sounds better, more forward, stronger. They sound pretty good. It's just again, source wise, if you have a source that's a little harsher, or you have tips that are more open and they're emphasizing that little bit, your female vocals are going to go quickly from forward and strong to, harsh and a little bit sibilant. So I say forward and strong, but that's really a dialed in version of what it might sound like out of the box. But generally, there's just more upper mid emphasis and not necessarily any more detail, especially in the lower mid, and it lost a little bit about that smoothness that you really liked about the 03, and especially that natural smoothness where instruments sounded just like the instrument. You sort of lose that on the A8 because of this upper mid. Everything is stretched just a little bit higher, so little mixes, little me, that acoustic version, their voices are just shift a little bit higher, a little bit more fatiguing, and you got to be really careful about volume and a little bit too high, and it's going to get pretty fatiguing pretty quickly. So tips, source, again, helps that problem. So treble, that, this whole area, and the Mini had a very similar peak around that 5 to 6 area. It just hits people in the wrong part of their ear occasionally. If it's just a little bit too high, you get really fatigued really quickly with that 5 to 6K area. So do think about how to mitigate that with tips and your source, and to bring that down a little bit. Because without doing it, instruments can cause a ringing in your ears, is how I hear it. And you kind of go, like, quieter parts from the song sound fine, and then as soon as maybe the guitars from the Cure song come in, and they start to kind of ring right in the center of your ear, and you're like, that's what fatigue sounds like to me. And it can also dominate the track where it really shouldn't. And dance tracks with high synth, kind of same problem. That high synth is up a notch with this boost, so it kind of becomes fatiguing a little quicker. So Go-Go Penguin's Signal and the Noise, it's that piano that really pops out a little more out of place than it should because of the graph and the way they tuned it, and the way the balance is now shifted towards the upper end. So just a bit over boosted is kind of what I would say, and definitely, as I've said 20 times, tips and whatever your mitigation strategy is to get that area down a little bit is what you really want to do, because it sounds much, much better if you can dial it into your preferences versus using the tips out of the box or a source that's way too bright and detailed, because that's just going to emphasize the wrong bits of the A8. So stage, again, very much source dependent. On something like this dongle, it's very much between your ears, in the head. It didn't really feel like an 03 all that much, plus it was a little bit brighter, and it felt more in your face than it should, especially from the 03. On a better source like my Q5K with tips, where everything gets pushed back kind of in place, that's a much better version of the A8. So yeah, that one varies quite a bit. It's not the 03 is what I will say. You can get close to it, but I think people like me who are big fans of the 03 stage and the way it was sort of effortlessly wide in front of you and pushed back, you were a couple rows back from the performer. I think it lost a little bit of that, especially on the brighter parts, which come more in your face and swamp out some of the lower instruments. So a lot of that imaging and positioning that were really nice on the 03, it lost a little bit of that as well. And that trade-off is just a more upper range presence, which is going to help for some people on some instruments, but maybe hurt the stage a little bit, in my opinion. So that's about it. That is the A8, formerly known as Prometheus. And thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see you next time.